This is lecture number 12, and we're still on the fourth section, the fourth part. Remembering that in the beginning we talked about the fact that this course would include something on mission, and this is really what we're concerned about, is how to communicate the gospel in an understanding way. Not just study Islamic theology, which you can do at any university, really, and probably with a greater degree of scholarship, in the sense of that study more about in an academic way. But we're interested here now about, in this lecture, about some early Christian-Muslim interaction, and we are going to be talking about some missionary endeavors, and specifically about some nobler mission attempts. The book by James Addison, The Christian Approach to Muslims, published in 1942. Addison says that on page 217, he says that the founding of the Franciscan and Dominican orders in the early 13th century begins a new chapter in mission to Muslims. He says, now there's a deliberate attempt to win them by peaceful means. And Latourette also, in his History of Christianity, Volume 1, page 495, mentions the same thing. So we'll take a few of these, and the first one is Peter the Venerable. Peter the Venerable used Christian literature to refute Islam, and if I'm not mistaken, was the first one to translate the Quran from Arabic in AD 1143. But I think the one that I really like to talk about, and we've already mentioned some, is St. Francis of Assisi. This was during the Fifth Crusade. You know, let's keep in mind that not just Protestants have made noble attempts to win Muslims to Christ, but Roman Catholics have as well. And this one I really like. In fact, I'm just thinking that I could use it for my blog, warrenlarson.com, because it's possible that we could be moving into a similar era where the thinking of Christians, along with the rest of the world, the non-Muslim world, is becoming more and more antagonistic, more and more sort of hateful of Christians, of Muslims. And so what Francis of Assisi did during the Fifth Crusade is quite remarkable. How he attempted to witness to the greatest Muslim leader there in the Crusades. It was early 13th century, and Saint Francis of Assisi had been a wealthy young man. He had been released from power and greed, and enabled him to move into a higher level of spiritual power. And he attempted to win no less than Kamal the Sultan of Egypt during the Fifth Crusade in the year 1219. It's an incredible story, to say the least. Such holy faith and courage is rare. To attempt to convert the most powerful Muslim personage would seem utter folly, but that's what he tried to do. The purposeless Fifth Crusade was dragging on. Francis and those closest to him prayed about the mission for a month, gained much strength, and he took a dozen of them through Syria and then to his mission in Egypt. The Pope, by the way, had said no, but he appealed to the Cardinal Pelagius for permission to travel to the Sultan. So radical was the Sultan, he promised a Byzantine gold piece for anyone who brought the head of a Christian. Cardinal said that the Sultan was treacherous, brainless, and false-hearted, but after some delay he did grant permission because of the unusual zeal of St. Francis. And he took his friend Elumato, and as they walked straight into the battlefield, they were caught, beaten, and brought to the Sultan, who was happy because he thought that they wanted to become Muslims. On the contrary, says Francis, we have a message that you should surrender your soul to God. And with this introduction, he proclaimed the triune God and Jesus Christ, Savior of all. When the Sultan was advised to behead them, he said no, and invited them to stay as guests. Francis said, if you are willing to become converts to Christ, you and your people, I shall only be too glad to stay with you. Such a response to Arab hospitality was unheard of. Francis also offered to walk through fire, if it would help to convince them. And if he came out unharmed, the Sultan should be prepared to embrace Christianity. The Sultan demurred, but was impressed, and he offered presents, which St. Francis declined to accept. Kamal was even more amazed and permitted him to preach the gospel in his house compound, and upon his departure asked the friar to pray for him. Listen to that. Asking that God would show him the right way. Obviously, the Sultan never did convert, for he was the one who retook Jerusalem. But Stephen Neal, in the History of Mission, says it was a manifestation of a new era, that now by love and good deeds conversion was to take place, not by force of arms. After that attempt covered below, St. Francis sent Franciscan missionaries to Moscow, where 5 were martyred. So that is St. Francis of Assisi during the 5th Crusade. We hear a lot about what St. Francis did, but that what they did in reference to Muslims is certainly worth our while to look at. Now there is Ricaldo de Monte Croce. Here was a Dominican who produced much informed literature during the latter part of the 13th century, and William of Tripolis, in a book called On the Condition of the Saracens, pointed out the commonalities and the nearness of Muslim faith to Christian faith. Now, as we have been thinking and talking about the Crusades, and obviously there is a lot of wrong with them, but nevertheless, some good did come out of them. And, Europeans are now going to try to make things right. And so monks in particular, one of whom was Ricaldo de Monte Croce, this Dominican had a different approach than the spirit of the times. He dealt with traditional areas of polemic, but he goes on to talk of Muslim virtues. And he left his mark on missiology, as we call it today, because he wanted to build relationships over the long haul. He tried to make contact in major cities and relate to Muslim Arab culture. He set out in Italy in 1288, and he had great ability in Arabic, by the demonstrated fact that he stayed in Egypt for 6 months. Then he went to Baghdad. Often he tried to get the Nestorian church and the Jacobite churches to revive them and to interact with Kurds and others. And so he became somewhat of a model of mission to Muslims. He attended Muslim schools because he felt it was a good way to learn the Quran. He welcomed socially into he was welcomed into Muslim homes to share the good news of Christ. He did not neglect to talk about the positive things among Muslims, their devotion, their hospitality, their unity, their good manners, and respect for God. But he did vehemently reject their beliefs, yet he respected them. And he did write a book called Against the Law of the Saracens, in which he sharply criticizes Islam. But Sweetman says that he gave Martin Luther some knowledge of Islam in his book, Volume 2, page 116, Islam and Christian Theology, and also the Muslim World, 1918, Volume 8, and pages 45 to 51. This fellow, Ricaldo de Monte Croce, had certain rules in his work with Muslims. no interpreters, know the scriptures, the text, not just an exposition, know the doctrines of the different sects, discuss religion with leaders, be fervent, faithful, moved by the love of God. So this is quite a model for us as well. And I've always talked his actions and his rules. Let's look at Raymond Lull, 1235 to 1315. Latourette, in his great History of Christianity, does talk about this, volume 1, page 44, and he gives good courage, as does Ruth Tucker in her book From Jerusalem to Arian Jaya. What was his mission? Well, the mission of Raymond Lull was certainly in a context of hostility, and he chose another way to reach Muslims. He had been drawn to North Africa in his 30s when he felt an irrepressible call from God. And James Addison, page 41, says that from the hour of his conversion to the hour of his martyrdom, the central strand of his manifold career and ardent activity was missionary. I think of one of our students who just sent me her testimony of how God had called her into mission. And someday I'm thinking I can put it on my blog, because it is a remarkable testimony that God is still calling people to work among Muslims, and his call is varied, but nevertheless he is calling, and he will guide people who want to do his will, particularly as we're thinking now of Muslims. Not that just Muslim is the only thing you can do as a missionary, but that is our focus. Now, what was the method of Raymond Lull? I previously said that he was a Jesuit. I think that's a mistake. He was not a Jesuit, although the Jesuits did do some good mission work. He was Franciscan. He wrote evangelistic literature. He helped start evangelistic centers for Arabic study in Islam. He appealed to popes. He boldly proclaimed Christ in North Africa. And one good resource here is a book written by Samuel Zwemer, and the name of the book is Raymond Lull, First Missionary to the Muslims. I don't think he was the first missionary, but nevertheless, he certainly was one of the first ones. Lull was disliked by the Dominicans, and he later joined, as I've said, the Franciscan. He was confrontational, there's no question about it, and he was somewhat provocative, but definitely his method was better than war. He emphasized spiritual and intellectual preparation, careful study of the language. In this case, it was Arabic. Theology and philosophy were not neglected. He set up missionary colleges in Majorca. He worked patiently with 5 popes, pleading with them to set up schools to support the effort. What a servant of God he was. And apparently he had 30 or 35 converts in Tunisia. His life was one of total commitment. Before his death, he said, "Everything I have in the world, I have left that I might honor God, procure the good of others, and exalt the faith. I've learned Arabic, labored to convert Muslims, nearly a decade of labor. I've been flogged and imprisoned for 45 years. I've labored to move the church and Christian princes that they might promote the common weal of the church." Well, what motivated this guy? It's hard to say what motivated him. But certainly it was the love of God that worked in his heart. Lull said, "I see many knights going to the Holy Land, beyond the seas, and thinking that they can acquire it by force of arms. But in the end all are destroyed before they attain that which they think they have. Whence it seems to me that the conquest of the Holy Land ought not to be attempted except in the way in which thou and thine apostles acquired it, namely by love and prayers, the pouring out of tears and of blood." This is what Zwemer says, page 52 to 53. I sometimes think that it would be possible, it is conceivable, that in our day that there be a similar context where people become so anti-Muslim, so hateful, that they would advocate any and all means to get rid of Muslims, including militarily. But Raymond Lull's question is good for us. How can we defeat Islam? Do we want to defeat Islam, or do we want to win Muslims to Christ, is the question. Raymond Lull did learn some valuable lessons, but they were difficult lessons. At one point, during the 9 years he devoted to the study of Arabic, he viciously struck one of his slaves who had cursed the Son of God. And then the slave, when he was in prison, committed suicide. So Lull did have some failures in his life, but he refused to be discouraged, either through his own failure in love or the general feeling of apathy and hatred toward Muslims right around him. He said, "Let patience have her perfect work." He said, "I scarcely see no one, O Lord, who out of love for thee is ready to suffer martyrdom as thou hast suffered for us. Now I'm old and poor, yet still I have the same purpose. I trust that with the grace of God I may persevere thereunto unto death." Says Raymond Lull, in his, according to Zwemer, he had grieved over the Crusades. He was convinced that not by force of arms, but by love they would convert. And I think that he was dead on in that issue. His martyrdom, it came when he was very old. It came again in the context of the Spanish martyrs movement. It came by stoning. And Lull is now 82 years old. He was preaching in the marketplace in a fanatical town in Bugia, Algeria, June the 30th, 1315. And it does seem that he was very much wanted to die, because you don't publicly preach on the superiority of Christ over Muhammad in a context like that, which he did. He turned the attention of the world toward their responsibility with an unquenchable zeal. Francis had shown courage. Lull showed courage and endurance. He stuck with the task, and this was his only purpose, so we have much to learn from him. Thinking of North Africa today and the way that the Berbers are responding to the gospel, I can't help but think that God is bringing fruit out of that part of the world that was so anti-Christian and that stoned Raymond Lull. Another person is Jérôme Scavier. We won't say much necessarily a whole lot about him, but he was Portuguese. He was a grandnephew of Francis Scavier. He headed the third mission by the Jesuits to the Mughal court in Lahore. That is in Pakistan today, which was then India. He was involved in a couple of missions, and the third one, I guess the third one he was involved with lasted 10 years, from 1595 to 1605, and he didn't have very many converts. But he did do some writing, undertook to write 3 books. One was called the third one was called A Mirror Showing the Truth, sort of a dialogue style. And it was something like John of Damascus had written. He defended the doctrine of the Trinity, the deity of Christ, and he tried to show the superiority of Christianity over Islam. And so here is his writings. Of course, his book was responded to in the sense that in 1621, a Persian by the name of Ahmad ibn Zayn al-Bildin wrote in response and argued that the Bible had many, prophecies of Muhammad, including the Paraclete issue in John. He also said that there are many discrepancies in the Bible, and against the Trinity he wrote, and one thing another, and talked about the greatness of Muhammad. So there were others as well in this account. The one was the Theodore Abu Qura, and who was the 9th century, the Bishop of Heren. Another would be Yahya bin Adi the Jacobite. And then you had others too, who, for instance, the Nestorians, they did some work, and various people like that. The Nestorians did quite a bit of work. And many others could be mentioned. Anastasius, the monk of Cluny. Others were unnamed Franciscan monks, and many were martyred in in their efforts to win Muslims to Christ. But I think that as we look at it, there are quite a few. There is although there is a growing concern and sensitivity toward Muslims, unfortunately there's often a tragic mix of politics and religion. Some churches did not survive, but others did. We also think that the Nestorians missed some great opportunities to work with Muslims, and missed opportunities. We could talk we could have, by the way, we could have talked about other great missionaries like Henry Martin and Karl Fander and French and Clark and Gardner and Zwemer and others, but we're now going to go on to relevant Christian witness and some specific things that we deal with as we encounter Muslims.